Putin has won another term in Russia, his fifth consecutive term as Russian president. Is there anything that can break his stronghold on this country? Let's take a look. This man is 77 years old and he's been in office since Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, and he has stayed in office. Today, he has won his fifth term by a complete landslide in an election that has widely been criticized for lacking any democratic legitimacy, appearing democratic, but not really being so. Now, according to Russia's Central Election Commission, 87% of the vote has come in for Putin after about 60% of the precincts have been counted. As a result, he now overtakes Stalin and becomes Russia's longest serving leader in over 200 years. Now, you didn't need a crystal ball to predict that Putin was going to win this election. But what does it mean for Russia and the world going forward? Remember, there was the conflict with Ukraine and the fact that he was taking on the West head on, and the crackdown of dissent at home. All of that now culminating in this massive landslide victory. Let's take a look first at how Vladimir Putin runs this system. He is, without a shadow of doubt, a dictator. He runs the country of Russia with an iron hand in a political system that he has designed to keep himself in power for eternity. He has maintained an appearance of a democracy without having one by a carefully controlled network. Now, in Russia, Putin and the establishment at the Kremlin controls the media entirely. Nothing is said on the media that doesn't have his blessing. The police, the investigative agencies, the state agencies, the courts, all run based on his instruction. Also, the rich and the powerful of Russia, the business people, are kept rich and powerful by their closeness to government, for which they pay bribes, and government, of course, makes room for them by moving the rules around so they can stay rich and powerful. Now, all of that also works in Putin's favor. And of course, finally, he's managed to control every aspect of dissent. Nobody is allowed to question him in Russia, and even if they're doing it from overseas. So even before the results of this election came out, the BBC had called this a premier league, where Putin was a premier candidate in a league that he had designed for himself, where he wrote his own rules, he chose the political system, and he handpicked every opponent. If any candidate seemed too strong for him, they were either exiled, or they were thrown in prison, or worse still, assassinated. In fact, just last month, Russia's most prominent rival to Putin, Alexei Navalny, died in an Arctic prison last month. And there was a massive outpouring of grief from within Russia and from across the world, and shock at the manner in which he was treated for simply questioning Putin. But all of that meant nothing, because Putin has now come back to power. Now, in order to maintain an appearance of a democracy, there is a small sort of weak opposition that is allowed to function, that they oppose small, unimportant matters on a regular basis to give the impression that something is still working in that country. But Putin essentially runs a system that is on constant clampdown of media and of dissent, wherever they may be. Russia's presidential elections last month and the results this month, people assumed that Putin would return for his fifth term for all of these reasons. And of course, he did. He will stay in power at least till 2030. The election was, of course, also a big test of support for the war on Ukraine, for which Russia, and specifically Putin, has been receiving a lot of criticism across the world for the death of Navalny and his treatment of opposition and any sort of dissent within the country. Remember the dramatic mutiny of the Wagner group that happened not too long ago either. All of that, and Russia is taking this as, or Putin is taking this as sort of a confirmation that the people of Russia are largely on his side. Let's take a look at the popularity numbers. The Levada Center in Russia, which is a non-government polling center, even before the elections were conducted, said Putin's approval rating was 80%, 80, which means 80% of the people in Russia approve of his performance so far. People who spoke to the media basically said that they couldn't see among the opposition anyone who could take the job, given how stressful it was and given how efficient Putin appeared to be. It was sort of a Putin versus who situation, because they didn't know anyone in the opposition who could do such a good job. Through this victory, of course, Putin will now have the power to further clamp down and further push his system where he controls the media, the courts, the public prosecutors, and keep himself in power. Now, there were three other candidates sort of approved by the government itself. There was a communist candidate who got about 4% votes, and the number 3 and a number 4 whose votes were even smaller. All of the opposition candidates who meant something were either barred from the election, exiled, imprisoned, or have died under suspicious circumstances. Now, the nationwide turnout for the vote is about 74% when polls closed. Elections officials say that this was surpassing even the 2018 elections, in which also Putin won. But something doesn't add up, because remember, thousands of Putin's opponents staged a protest against him on Sunday. Although there was no independent reports of how many of Russia's 114 million voters took part in demonstrations, we know 74 people were arrested on Sunday across the country. Also, during Navalny's funeral, there were visuals of people braving the biting cold and standing in the cold for a very, very long time to simply pay their respects to this man. A couple of the opponents who came up against Putin also had a large outpouring of support to people who stood to sign their forms and to sort of vouch for their candidature. Nothing has appeared to have translated to votes. Now, there are reports that say the Kremlin also has many tools to control and inflate voter numbers and voter turnout. There's also strong evidence that Russian authorities simply falsify electoral figures. And there's a goal, basically, according to international media, that not just ensure a victory for Putin, but ensure a decisive majority, a giant landslide to sort of give him that confidence that he's on the right track. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Bang on note, as soon as the election was sort of clear, there was a press conference that Putin addressed in which he made clear that he feels vindicated for all of his stands, especially his invasion of Ukraine, because of the result of this election. He also took on the West straight off the bat. He said, and I'm quoting, "No matter how much they want to intimidate us, it has not worked now, nor will it work in the future. Never," end quote. He also took a swipe at the US for their election, saying, "Is it democratic to use administrative resources against one of your presidential candidates, using the judiciary, among other things," end quote. Effectively making a reference to the cases against Donald Trump and perhaps sort of voicing his support for Donald Trump in this whole game of strongman elections. Now, from the West, the US has made a statement from the White House saying this election does not appear free or fair, as how Putin imprisoned his political opponents and prevented others from running against him. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary David Cameron has said this is not free or fair elections either. Ukraine's Zelensky has said the election is flawed and it has no legitimacy and it cannot have any. But as it seems, it doesn't matter, because Putin is now emboldened by this victory and also by the massive landsliding numbers that I told you about. 87% also sends a very clear message to the rich and the powerful and the political elite of Russia, saying that there is only one man in charge here and he's not going anywhere. So there really, for the next few years, no point in standing up in opposition against him at all. You might as well fall in line. And that's important, because this means that less than a year after that dramatic Wagner mutiny, remember, the man who led that mutiny, Varghese, wound up in a plane crash 2 months after that, and he's dead. For the time being, the message is very clear from Russia: one man remains in charge, because neither the media, nor the courts, nor the investigative agencies, or the opposition can do anything about it. A democracy is only a democracy when its checks and balances work. These are the checks and balances. So in Russia, at least, until either the media or the opposition or the police and the investigative agencies, the courts, find a way to stand up and actually be a balance against the man in power, he will stay in power.